Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about graphing and what, hang on, what is going on? Okay, there we go. Jeez, that was weird. Okay, so today we're going to focus on graphing and we're going to learn how to graph in different ways. So before we get into graphing, I need to talk about data. So the title of our notes today is going to be graphing. But first, let me go over some things about data. There are two different types of data. The first type is called quantitative data. And quantitative data has to do with any kind of number. So we call it numerical data. So anything with numbers. And when you have quantitative data, usually you do some statistics. So usually this involves using statistics. And the second type of data is called qualitative. And qualitative data is not numerical, so it's non-numerical. And sometimes we call it categorical. And so just to give you some examples, for quantitative data, an example would be like 8 tomatoes. And for qualitative data, an example could be red tomatoes. Okay, so like you could say red versus green tomatoes. Okay, so there's two types of data. And then also when you are designing an experiment, so when designing an experiment, you have to include what variables you're going to have in your experiment. So there are different variables. And I'm going to go over 3 different variables. And the first type of variable is called the independent variable. And the independent variable is the factor that is different between the groups in your experiment. So the factor that is manipulated in your experiment. Okay, and I like to think of it as the factor that is different between the groups. So, for example, if I were to compare bacteria growth at different temperatures, then the different temperatures would be my independent variable. Okay, so I'm going to write an example. Let's say we're doing an experiment where we are observing bacterial growth at different temperatures. The independent variable would be the different temperatures. Okay. The second variable is called the dependent variable. And the dependent variable is the outcome of the experiment. In other words, what you are measuring in the experiment. Okay, and so for my example, I'm observing bacterial growth at different temperatures. So what I'm measuring in the end is the bacterial growth. So that's my dependent variable. Okay, so once you run an experiment and you collect data, and you have different types of data, you have different variables in your experiment. Actually, I have one more variable, and that would be the control variable. So a control variable is one where it is the same in all the groups. So this is a factor that is the same in all the groups. So in my experiment with the bacterial growth in the different temperatures, hang on. So in our experiment with the bacterial growth, the control variable would be, for example, the type of petri dish that we're growing the bacteria in, or the room, the science room, or the nutrient material that you're giving the bacteria, which is the food for the bacteria. So it is all the other factors that you're going to control for and keep it controlled, and you're just going to change the one factor, which is the independent variable. Okay, so now let's talk about graphing. So we've done an experiment. Tomorrow's lecture video talks about all the different steps in the scientific method, and I will talk about experiments in that video. But for this, we're going to focus on graphing. And once you've done an experiment, you've collected your data. And there are different types of graphs that you can use. So let's talk about graphing. There are different types of graphs. And I'm going to go over 4 different kinds of graphs. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called a pie chart. And a pie chart is used when you have different pieces of a whole piece. So when you want to show different proportions of a whole, okay? And so the pie chart is very handy. Usually you see them using like percentages. Of course, you can use numbers, but it's a good visual to see how big a piece is of the whole thing. And let me show you an example. Okay, so here is an example of a pie chart. Let me move this up so we can look at it. And let me zoom in a little. So here's our pie chart, and this pie chart is showing the different amounts of water that is used. And so you can see like where all the water is going. And so you can just, by looking at this, you can see that flushing the toilet uses the most water. And then you can also see that washing your clothes uses a lot of water. And so this would give you a quick way to see like where all the water is going. So that's what a pie chart would be used for, is looking at the different proportions in the whole. Okay, a second type of graph is called a histogram. And a histogram is when you want to see different frequencies. So this is used when you want to see different frequencies. Okay, and let me show you an example. Okay, and so here is a histogram. And what this tells you is it tells you how many you have in each category. Okay, and so this is showing you a histogram of weights and how many you have, how frequent each weight is. And so just by looking at this graph, you can see that 140 is the most frequent weight. Okay, and then the third type of graph that we have is called a bar graph. Okay, a bar graph is used when you have the 2 variables, your independent variable and your dependent variable, and one of those variables is a categorical data. So when either your dependent variable or your independent variable is categorical, which means qualitative, and the other one is quantitative. Okay? And so that would look like this. Let me show you an example. So this is an example of a bar graph. And so if a survey was taken in class and we were asking the students, what is your favorite sport to watch? And you put it on a bar graph like this is very easy to see immediately that people like to watch soccer and the most, and people like to watch hockey the least. And then the last type of graph is called a line graph. And a line graph is used when both your independent variable and dependent variable, line graph is when both the independent variable and dependent variable are numerical, so quantitative. Okay, so they're both numerical, and then you would put a line graph. And a line graph shows the relationship between the two variables. Okay, you can see if they are correlated or not. And I'm going to show you an example of a line graph. Okay, so this line graph is showing the different, let's see, the monthly sales over a period of time. Okay, so time is down here, and there's a data point for each month, and it's telling you, you know, the number of sales in thousands. So you can see, you know, when it was high, and then the trend that it's going down, and so this will show you the pattern. So those are the 4 types of graphs. Another thing that I want to tell you is that when making your graphs, you have to have these are the rules for making a graph. Okay. On the x-axis, you always put your independent variable. So the independent variable goes on the x-axis. Okay, and the x-axis is the one that goes straight across. So that's the horizontal line. Okay, and then on the vertical line that is called the y-axis, you put the dependent variable. Goes on the y-axis. This is the vertical line. Okay, and then the last thing that a graph must have is a title. Okay, and so, for example, this graph right here has a title of 6-month sales report and forecast. So you have to have a title so that the reader can immediately know what they're looking at. And then the last thing is if you have more than one variable showing on a graph, like for example, you have more than one dependent variable on a line graph, then you would need a key. Okay, and a key would tell you, you know, what each line stands for. Okay, so that's it for graphing, and I hope you guys enjoy your graphing experience, and happy graphing.